When 47 prize bulls suddenly stormed through Grace Miller's soybean fields before sunrise, everyone assumed it was just another unfortunate accident. Her wealthy neighbor stood at the fence with a smug smile, insisting that broken fences and wandering livestock were simply part of country life. Most people believed him. But Grace noticed something no one else did. Every registered breeding bull carried electronic identification tags, distinctive brands, and carefully documented breeding records. Without realizing it, the neighbor had released the only witnesses that could prove exactly where they came from. And when investigators finally examined the herd, those expensive animals became the strongest evidence against their own owner. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel if you believe hardworking farmers deserve the truth when powerful neighbors refuse to accept responsibility. Grace Miller had lived on the same Kansas farm for nearly 30 years. It wasn't the largest farm in Harper County, but it had always been enough. 180 acres of soybeans, alfalfa, and hay provided a steady living after her husband, David, passed away nearly a decade earlier. Every fence post had a purpose. Every field had a schedule. Every acre mattered. Her western property line bordered one of the largest registered Angus breeding ranches in the county. The ranch belonged to Douglas Kane, successful, wealthy, confident. His prize breeding bulls regularly sold for tens of thousands of dollars at livestock auctions across the Midwest. Douglas often reminded people of that fact. "You don't build a herd like mine by making mistakes," he liked to say. Grace usually ignored him. Their relationship had never been friendly, but it had remained civil until that September morning. At 5:18 a.m., Grace woke to an unusual sound. Not thunder. Not machinery. The deep, heavy pounding of dozens of hooves. She hurried onto the front porch. Across the soybean field, dark shapes were moving through the early morning fog. At first, she thought they were deer. Then one animal lifted its head, a mature Angus bull. Then another, and another. Within seconds, she realized the truth. Dozens of bulls were charging through her crops. By the time she reached the field with her pickup, 47 massive breeding bulls had scattered across more than 40 acres of soybeans. Plants that had taken months to grow disappeared beneath thousands of pounds of trampling hooves. Rows that had been perfectly straight the evening before were now flattened into muddy paths. Grace immediately called the county sheriff's office. Then she contacted the county livestock officer. While waiting for help, she resisted the urge to drive the bulls out herself. 47 mature breeding bulls were far too dangerous to handle alone. Instead, she did something unexpected. She took photographs. Hundreds of them. Every animal. Every ear tag. Every freeze brand. Every section of damaged crops. She slowly walked the edge of the field using her phone's zoom lens. One bull wore a bright blue electronic identification tag. Another carried a yellow interstate health tag. Several displayed registered Angus tattoos inside their ears. Grace photographed every visible number. An hour later, Douglas Kane finally arrived. He climbed out of his new diesel pickup wearing expensive boots that looked as though they had never touched mud. He glanced across the destroyed soybean field, then shrugged. "Looks like my boys found a weak spot in the fence." His voice sounded almost amused. "Livestock gets loose. It happens." Grace looked directly at him. 47 breeding bulls? Douglas smiled. "They're animals. They don't always read property lines." Several neighboring farmers had gathered along the county road. Some quietly shook their heads. Others whispered that Grace would never recover the crop before harvest. Douglas folded his arms confidently. "I've got insurance. We'll figure something out." But Grace wasn't looking at Douglas anymore. She was looking at the bulls. Unlike ordinary feeder cattle, these weren't anonymous livestock. Each one carried permanent identification. Each one had registration records. Each one represented years of breeding history worth thousands of dollars. Without realizing it, Douglas hadn't just sent 47 bulls into her crops. He had sent 47 pieces of evidence. As the first county livestock trailers began pulling into the field, with additional trailers and handlers already on the way, Grace quietly saved every photograph to two separate storage locations. She had a feeling she would need every single one. By sunrise, the quiet soybean field had turned into an active scene. Two deputies from the sheriff's office parked along the county road. The county livestock officer arrived with 3 stock trailers, while additional haulers were called because 47 mature bulls could not be transported safely in only 3 loads. Their first priority was simple: remove the bulls before anyone got hurt. Registered breeding bulls were powerful animals. Even calm bulls could become aggressive in unfamiliar surroundings, especially when crowded together. Grace stayed behind a temporary safety barrier, while experienced handlers slowly separated and gathered the herd. To everyone's surprise, the animals behaved unusually well. They weren't running wildly. They weren't frightened. Instead, many lingered near the western boundary, occasionally looking back toward Douglas Kane's ranch. County Livestock Officer Ben Harlow noticed the behavior immediately. "They don't look lost," he said quietly. "They look like they expect to go back the same way they came." Grace followed his gaze toward the shared fence. From a distance, several wooden boards appeared broken. Douglas folded his arms. "There you go. Fence failed. That's all there is to it." Ben didn't answer. Instead, he walked toward the damaged section with one of the deputies. Grace followed several yards behind. At first glance, the opening looked convincing. 3 horizontal boards lay on the ground. One fence post leaned slightly. Douglas pointed confidently. "Old wood. Probably gave out overnight." Ben crouched beside the broken boards. He carefully examined the exposed wood without touching it more than necessary. "What do you see?" Grace asked. Ben remained thoughtful. "I'm not ready to say." He pointed toward one of the broken ends. "It doesn't immediately look like the kind of damage I usually see after cattle force their way through a fence." One deputy leaned closer. "The break looks unusually clean." Ben nodded. "Maybe. But appearances aren't evidence." He stood up. "I'd rather let the county investigator document it before anyone reaches conclusions." The deputy photographed every board exactly where it had fallen. Measurements were taken. Close-up images recorded the exposed wood, fence wire, and fasteners without disturbing the scene. Ben then continued inspecting the surrounding area. The fence staples remained firmly attached. Several strands of wire showed very little stretching. Again, he avoided drawing conclusions. "I've seen livestock do incredible things," he said. "So I'm not ruling anything in or out." Grace appreciated the answer. It sounded cautious, professional. Exactly what she expected from someone responsible for documenting facts rather than assigning blame. Then another detail caught Ben's attention. About 20 yards inside Douglas's property, fresh pickup tire tracks ran parallel to the fence. The previous day's light rain still glistened inside the tread marks. Ben photographed them from several angles. Douglas shrugged. "Ranch trucks drive here every day." "That's entirely possible," Ben replied. "Which is why we'll compare the timing with everything else." A few minutes later, one deputy discovered the nearby livestock gate. The chain remained intact. The latch showed no obvious structural damage, only several fresh scratches around the locking mechanism. Again, Ben avoided speculation. "Photograph it. Leave everything exactly as it is. If necessary, the county investigator can examine it later." Douglas's confident expression remained unchanged. "There has to be a simple explanation." Ben closed his notebook. "There may be. And that's exactly why we collect evidence before forming opinions." Just then, Grace's nephew Ethan pulled into the field carrying a drone case. "I heard what happened," he said. "I flew my drone before the livestock trailers arrived." Ben looked up. "When?" "About 20 minutes before sunrise." Ethan removed a memory card from the drone. "I think these photos show something important." Grace looked at him. "What is it?" Ethan took a slow breath. "From the air, the herd doesn't appear to have entered the field where everyone first assumed." Ben Harlow waited until every bull had been safely separated and loaded into enough county and privately contracted livestock trailers before asking anyone another question. "Nobody moves these animals back to the ranch yet," he said. I want every identification number documented first. Douglas frowned. That's unnecessary. They're obviously my bulls. Ben remained calm. I don't doubt they belong to you. But this investigation isn't about ownership. It's about evidence. Each trailer was parked beneath the shade of an equipment shed, while county staff began recording every animal. Grace watched quietly from a safe distance. One by one, each bull passed through a portable livestock chute. The process was slow but routine. An RFID scanner recorded every electronic ear tag. Visual identification numbers were photographed. Freeze brands were documented. Several bulls also carried registration tattoos inside their ears. Nothing was left to memory. Everything was entered into the county livestock database. Douglas glanced impatiently at his watch. How much longer is this going to take? Ben didn't even look up. As long as it needs to. About an hour later, Dr. Laura Jensen, the county veterinarian, arrived. She specialized in registered breeding cattle and had worked with ranches throughout Kansas for nearly 20 years. After reviewing the identification records, she looked toward Douglas. These aren't ordinary commercial bulls. Douglas nodded proudly. They're some of the best genetics in the state, Doctor. Jensen continued reading the registration sheets. Exactly. She turned toward Grace. That's why something about this situation doesn't make sense. Grace asked quietly, "What do you mean?" The veterinarian pointed toward the trailers. Registered breeding bulls like these aren't usually kept in one large group without careful management. They're valuable. Very valuable. She explained that mature breeding bulls often represented years of selective genetics. Many were insured. Some had semen marketed nationwide. Others were scheduled for upcoming breeding programs. They're monitored constantly, she said. Experienced ranchers don't simply allow 47 prize bulls to move from a controlled holding pasture without a reason. Ben nodded. And 47 of them escaping together, Doctor? Jensen shook her head slowly. I've investigated livestock escapes for years. I've seen 2 bulls get loose, 5, maybe 10 after severe storm damage. She looked back toward the trailers. But 47 registered breeding bulls leaving the same property at the same time is extraordinarily unusual. Douglas folded his arms. They followed one another. That's what cattle do. They certainly do, Doctor. Jensen replied. But only after something starts the movement. Her words lingered in the air. Ben continued reviewing the electronic records. One entry immediately caught his attention. Bull number K118. A nationally recognized breeding sire valued at nearly $80,000. Unlike the others, his file included additional equipment. Interesting, Ben murmured. Grace stepped closer. What is it? Ben pointed toward the paperwork. This bull wears an active GPS monitoring collar. Douglas answered quickly. We track him because he's our lead sire. Ben looked up. Does the collar record movement history? Douglas hesitated. It should. Ben closed the folder. Then I'd like a copy of that data. Douglas's expression changed almost instantly. The ranch office handles that. It may take a while. Ben smiled politely. That's fine. We'll wait. As the last trailer door closed, Grace glanced once more at the line of registered Angus bulls. Only a few hours earlier, they had been destroying her soybean field. Now each animal carried something far more valuable than breeding genetics. Each one carried digital records, identification numbers, registration history, and perhaps the first clues explaining exactly how 47 prize bulls had arrived in her crops before sunrise. Douglas Kane didn't send the GPS records that afternoon or the next morning. Instead, his attorney informed the sheriff's office that the ranch needed time to retrieve archived movement data from its livestock management system. Ben Harlow wasn't surprised. That's their right, he told Grace. But if the records exist, we'll review them. Meanwhile, Ethan copied the drone photographs he had captured shortly before sunrise. The images weren't dramatic. They simply showed the soybean field from above. Ben enlarged the first photograph inside the sheriff's office. At first glance, the damaged crops appeared random. After several minutes, however, a clear pattern emerged. The flattened rows formed a narrow path, beginning near the western property line before spreading across the center of Grace's soybean field. Ben traced the route with his finger. They appear to have entered together. Grace nodded. Not from different directions. Just one. A second aerial photograph revealed another detail. The grass between Douglas's ranch road and the shared gate had been heavily compressed. Unlike the surrounding pasture, which still held morning dew, one strip appeared darker and freshly disturbed. It looked as though a large group of cattle had crossed the area only a short time before sunrise. 2 days later, Douglas's attorney delivered the requested GPS records for Bull K118. Before reviewing the files, the county's digital evidence technician verified that the exported data matched the ranch's tracking system and showed no signs of alteration. The movement history was then displayed on a digital map. For most of the night, the lead bull remained inside Douglas's breeding pasture. Nothing unusual. Then, shortly before sunrise, the GPS points began moving steadily along the ranch service road toward the western boundary. The next recorded location placed the bull near the shared gate. A later position showed it inside Grace's property. Ben looked at the timeline. Remember, these collars don't record every second. They log locations at regular intervals. So we shouldn't assume the bull crossed the fence at the exact recorded minute. The digital evidence technician agreed. What matters isn't the precise second. It's the overall movement pattern. Grace studied the map. So regardless of the exact time, the bull traveled from the breeding pasture toward the shared gate. Correct, Ben replied. And every recorded position follows that same direction. The technician overlaid the GPS points onto Ethan's drone photographs. Although the timestamps weren't identical, the travel path closely matched the corridor of damaged crops visible from the air. Then another detail caught everyone's attention. One GPS point remained near the western gate before the next recorded position appeared inside Grace's field. Dr. Laura Jensen reviewed the map. Given the recording interval, it's reasonable to conclude the herd paused somewhere near the gate before continuing. She paused for a moment. Why they paused is something we'll have to determine using the rest of the evidence. Ben closed the laptop. Exactly. No single piece of evidence tells the whole story. But when independent evidence begins pointing in the same direction, that's when a timeline starts becoming reliable. For the first time, investigators weren't relying on assumptions. They were assembling independent pieces of evidence that, together, were beginning to explain how 47 prize breeding bulls had reached Grace's soybean field before sunrise. The GPS records changed the direction of the investigation. But Ben Harlow knew one thing from experience. Digital tracking alone rarely ended a dispute. Good evidence should support other evidence, he told Grace. If several independent sources tell the same story, that's when the truth becomes difficult to ignore. The next morning, Ben visited the Harper County Grain Cooperative, located less than half a mile from the shared property line. The facility overlooked County Road 18, the same road ranch trucks used before sunrise to reach Douglas Kane's western pasture. Ben wasn't expecting much. Most commercial security cameras were designed to monitor entrances, not neighboring farms. Still, the cooperative manager agreed to review the recordings. We keep footage for about 30 days, he explained. If something happened that morning, there's a chance we still have it. Inside the office, they loaded the video from September 14. The screen showed an empty road for several minutes. Then at 4:26 a.m., a white ranch pickup drove past heading west. Ben paused the video. The truck carried Douglas Kane Ranch logos on both front doors. Nothing illegal about that. Ranch trucks traveled the road every day. They continued watching. At 4:39 a.m., the same pickup returned. This time, it was traveling much more slowly. The rear cargo lights remained on. Ben wrote down the timestamps without making any assumptions. The footage alone didn't prove what the truck had been doing. It simply established where it had been. Later that afternoon, another piece of information arrived. A homeowner living across County Road 18 contacted the sheriff's office after hearing about the investigation. I've got security cameras facing my driveway, he told Ben. They sometimes catch traffic on the road. After obtaining written permission, investigators reviewed the homeowner's recordings. The angle wasn't perfect. Trees partially blocked the western fence line. Even so, one detail stood out. At approximately 4:34 a.m., headlights stopped near the entrance to Douglas's Western Service Road. The vehicle remained there for nearly 3 minutes before continuing. Ben compared the timestamp with the GPS records. Bull K118 had stopped near the same location for almost exactly the same length of time. The timing wasn't proof, but it was consistent. Very consistent. When Douglas met investigators the following day, Ben carefully explained what had been collected. "We're building a timeline." Douglas remained calm. "My foreman checks fences before sunrise all the time, especially during breeding season." Ben nodded. "That's certainly possible." "Who was driving the truck that morning?" Douglas hesitated. "I'd have to check the work schedule." "Please do." 2 days later, the ranch submitted employee timesheets. According to the records, ranch foreman Tyler Brooks had been assigned fence inspections before daylight. Investigators interviewed Tyler separately. His answer surprised everyone. "I checked the eastern pasture. I never went near the western gate." Ben looked up from his notebook. "Then who drove the ranch truck past County Road 18? Tyler slowly shook his head. "I honestly don't know." The room fell silent. No accusation had been made. No conclusion had been reached. But for the first time, the written work schedule, the GPS records, and the available camera footage no longer pointed in exactly the same direction. Someone's timeline wasn't matching the evidence. Because Douglas Cane Ranch used a fleet management system for its trucks, investigators requested the vehicle's electronic trip and driver records. The system required employees and managers to sign in with individually assigned electronic fobs before using a ranch vehicle. The records showed that the white pickup had been started at 4:19 a.m., using the driver fob assigned to Douglas Cane. Its dashboard system had also connected automatically to Douglas's mobile phone. The route recorded by the truck matched the cooperative camera, the homeowner's footage, and the tire tracks beside the western gate. When Ben presented the information, Douglas changed his explanation. He admitted driving to the western pasture, but claimed he had only conducted a brief inspection. He could not explain why he had initially allowed Tyler's work schedule to be submitted as the apparent explanation for the truck's movements. Ben had investigated enough agricultural disputes to know one simple rule: physical evidence rarely lied. People sometimes did. Over the next 2 weeks, investigators interviewed every employee who had worked the night shift or early morning at Douglas Cane Ranch. Each interview was conducted separately. Each witness was asked the same questions. What time did you arrive? Which pasture were you assigned? Who had access to the western gate? Did you notice anything unusual before sunrise? At first, the answers seemed ordinary. Feed deliveries, fence inspections, equipment maintenance, routine ranch work. But as Ben compared the statements side by side, small inconsistencies began appearing. One employee insisted the western pasture hadn't been checked until after 6 o'clock. Another believed someone had inspected it before dawn. A third remembered seeing the ranch pickup parked near the machine shed much earlier than usual. None of the contradictions proved wrongdoing alone. But together, they suggested that the ranch's timeline wasn't as clear as Douglas had claimed. 3 days later, investigators located Jacob Ellis, a former ranch hand who had left the operation earlier that summer. Jacob no longer worked for Douglas and had no financial connection to the ranch. Ben asked the same questions he had asked everyone else. Jacob answered calmly. Then Ben showed him an aerial photograph of the western gate. Jacob studied it for several seconds. "That's the old breeding pasture. You know it?" Ben asked. "I worked there for 5 years." Ben nodded. "Was that gate normally left open?" Jacob answered without hesitation. "Not while I worked there." He paused before continuing. "Those breeding bulls were too valuable. We were expected to keep that gate secured." Grace listened carefully. "So if the gate was found open that morning," Jacob chose his words with care, "I can only speak from my own experience. In 5 years at the ranch, I never saw that gate intentionally left open when mature breeding bulls were in that pasture. Ben made a note. That's helpful. It tells us what normal practice looked like. Jacob nodded. Exactly. I'm not saying what happened that morning. I'm only saying it wasn't how we operated when I was there. Ben then asked another question. Did Douglas ever talk about Grace? Jacob hesitated. I'm not accusing anybody, but I remember one conversation. He explained that several weeks before the incident, Douglas became frustrated after another disagreement over drainage work near the shared property line. According to Jacob, Douglas laughed and remarked, "She'll eventually learn this isn't the place to fight her neighbors." Ben wrote the statement exactly as Jacob remembered it. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't proof, but it established that tension existed before the livestock incident. Meanwhile, another interview uncovered something unexpected. A ranch mechanic produced a maintenance invoice showing that the Western Gate's hydraulic closer had been serviced and inspected just 2 days before the bulls entered Grace's field. The maintenance log confirmed the repair had been completed successfully. Grace looked toward Ben. So the gate wasn't simply waiting to fail? Ben answered cautiously. It tells us the gate had recently been serviced and was operating properly at that time. What happened afterward will have to be evaluated alongside the rest of the evidence. The investigator who examined the opening also concluded that the fallen wooden boards had been cut with a power saw and positioned to resemble impact damage. The wire showed none of the stretching expected, if 47 mature bulls had forced their way through it. Combined with the undamaged gate latch, the fresh scratches around the locking mechanism, Douglas's vehicle records, and the herd's movement toward a single opening, the scene no longer resembled an accidental fence failure. Late that Friday afternoon, Dr. Laura Jensen called with the laboratory findings. We've completed the feed and soil analysis. Ben looked up. What did you learn? Her reply was calm. I think the bulls themselves can now help us understand where they spent the early morning. For the second time in the investigation, Douglas's own prize herd was becoming one of the most reliable witnesses in the case. Dr. Jensen arrived at the county laboratory carrying a folder of examination reports. Grace and Ben waited quietly. No injuries? Grace asked. The bulls are healthy, Doctor. Jensen replied. But that's not what interests me. She opened the report. These samples tell us where they were feeding before they were removed. Ben studied the laboratory notes. Fresh soybean leaves, young stems, partially digested pods. Everything matched crops collected from Grace's damaged field earlier that morning. Douglas crossed his arms. Of course they ate soybeans. They were standing in a soybean field. Dr. Jensen nodded. Yes. But that's only part of the picture. She placed several photographs on the table. Each bull's hooves had been photographed before they were washed. The mud packed into the hoof grooves was unusually dark. County soil specialist Mark Benson compared the samples with soil taken from several nearby locations. His conclusion was straightforward. The composition is consistent with soil from Grace Miller's irrigated soybean field. He pointed to the report. It differs from the drier pasture soil collected on Douglas Kane's property. Ben looked toward Grace. So we now know the bulls remained inside your crops long enough to feed and move throughout the field. Mark nodded. And the damage pattern supports that. Using drone images and field measurements, he estimated that nearly 40 acres of soybeans had been trampled or grazed before the herd was removed. The destruction followed one continuous path from the western gate toward the center of the field. It wasn't scattered damage. It was one large movement. Douglas remained silent. Investigators continued documenting the facts. By the end of the afternoon, Ben placed the reports into the evidence file. The photographs, GPS records, vehicle data, laboratory results, and gate examination are all telling the same story. Grace looked through the window toward the livestock trailers. Ironically, the most valuable breeding herd in the county had become the strongest source of evidence. Without saying a single word, the bulls had documented exactly where they had been. Within days, Douglas Kane reported the incident to his ranch insurance company. According to the claim, the damage resulted from an accidental livestock escape caused by a failed fence. Normally, cases like this were settled quickly, but the claim adjuster noticed something unusual. The sheriff's office had already documented the scene. GPS records existed. RFID identification had been completed. Veterinary reports had been filed. The insurance company assigned senior agricultural adjuster Michael Reeves to review everything before making a decision. After visiting both properties, Reeves walked the damaged fence with Ben Harlow. "I've handled cattle claims for almost 20 years, he said. They're usually straightforward. He looked at the photographs of the fence. This one isn't. Over the next week, he reviewed the GPS timeline, laboratory reports, drone images, vehicle data, gate examination, and employee statements. Each piece of evidence supported the same sequence of events. None of it alone proved the entire case. Together, however, the evidence raised serious questions about whether the incident had been accidental. When Reeves met Douglas for a recorded interview, he asked a simple question. Can you explain why the physical and electronic evidence doesn't match the timeline described in your claim? Douglas hesitated before answering. I've told you everything I know. Reeves closed his notebook. Then we'll wait for the court's findings before making a final coverage decision. A week later, both parties received official notice. The county district court had scheduled a civil hearing to determine liability for the crop damage. For Grace, it wasn't about revenge. She wanted the truth documented. For Douglas, the case had become much bigger than damaged soybeans. His own prize herd had already become the strongest evidence in the investigation. Now the court would decide what that evidence meant. Several weeks later, both sides appeared in the Harper County District Court. Grace sat beside her attorney with a single binder containing every photograph, report, and document collected since the morning the bulls entered her field. Across the room, Douglas arrived with his legal team. The judge opened the hearing with a simple reminder. This court is here to determine responsibility based on evidence, not assumptions. Grace's attorney presented the case one step at a time. First came the photographs of the damaged soybean field. Then the drone images showing the herd's path. Next, Ben Harlow explained the condition of the fence and gate. The investigator presented evidence that the wooden boards had been cut and arranged to imitate livestock damage. After that, Dr. Laura Jensen described the veterinary findings and identification records for all 47 registered bulls. The fleet management records then showed that Douglas's assigned driver fob had started the ranch truck before dawn and that his phone had connected to the vehicle. Finally, the GPS data from the lead breeding bull was displayed on a large courtroom monitor. The blue line followed the ranch road, stopped briefly at the western gate, and then continued directly into Grace's soybean field. Douglas's attorney argued that GPS equipment wasn't perfectly accurate. The judge agreed. No technology is flawless, but accuracy must be considered together with all the other evidence. That was exactly what Grace's attorney had done. No single document proved the entire case, but every piece supported the same timeline. The photographs, the drone images, the GPS records, the vehicle data, the gate inspection, the veterinary reports, the employee interviews. Each one pointed in the same direction. Douglas testified that he had driven to the western pasture only to inspect the gate. But he could not explain why the fence boards appeared to have been cut before the bulls crossed, why the service gate had been opened, why his truck had remained beside the entrance while the lead bull paused there, or why he had initially allowed investigators to believe his foreman had been driving. Under the civil standard requiring proof by a preponderance of the evidence, Grace's attorney argued that the sequence was more likely deliberate than accidental. When the presentations ended, the courtroom became unusually quiet. The judge closed the evidence binder and looked toward both attorneys. I believe I've heard enough. Then he announced that a written decision would be issued within the following days. As everyone stood to leave, Grace glanced through the courtroom window. For the first time since that September morning, she felt the evidence had finally spoken for itself. 5 days later, both attorneys returned to the Harper County District Court to receive the judge's written decision. The courtroom was much quieter than during the hearing. There were no reporters. Only the two parties, their attorneys, and a handful of local farmers who had followed the case from the beginning. The judge spoke calmly. After reviewing the testimony and documentary evidence, the court finds that Mr. Kane deliberately opened, or caused to be opened, the western livestock access and directed the herd toward the shared boundary. He then failed to exercise reasonable control over 47 registered breeding bulls as they entered Mrs. Miller's property. He explained that the decision was not based on any single piece of evidence. Not one photograph. Not one GPS record. Not one witness. Instead, the ruling reflected the combined weight of the evidence presented throughout the hearing. The deliberately cut fence boards, the recently serviced gate, the drone photographs, the livestock identification records, the GPS movement history, the truck's fleet management data, the cooperative and residential camera footage, the veterinary findings, and the witness testimony. Taken together, the court concluded that Douglas Kane was legally responsible for the damage caused to Grace Miller's soybean crop. The judge then addressed compensation. The court finds liability. The final amount of compensatory damages shall be determined using the agricultural loss assessment and supporting documentation already submitted, together with any additional calculations required under state law. Grace's attorney nodded. That process had already begun. County agricultural specialists were completing their final valuation of crop loss, damaged irrigation lines, soil restoration costs, and related expenses. Once those figures were finalized, the judgment amount would be entered into the record. Because the court had found deliberate conduct rather than a purely accidental escape, Douglas's insurance company reserved its right to deny coverage for portions excluded under the policy's intentional acts provision. Any court-awarded damages not covered by insurance would become Douglas's personal responsibility. Douglas lowered his head. His attorney quietly placed a hand on his shoulder. As everyone prepared to leave, Douglas walked toward Grace. "I should have handled this differently," he admitted. Grace answered calmly. "I wasn't looking for a fight. I only wanted someone to accept responsibility." Douglas nodded. For the first time since that September morning, he offered no excuses. Outside the courthouse, Grace looked across the fields stretching toward the horizon. The legal process wasn't completely finished. There were still valuations to finalize and paperwork to complete. But the most important question had already been answered. The court had determined who was responsible. Everything that followed would simply establish the cost of making things right. As she drove home, Grace glanced toward the repaired fence. The soybeans would grow again next season. And this time, the truth had taken root just as firmly as the crop itself. Within several weeks, Douglas's insurance company completed its coverage review. It approved payment only for portions of the documented losses that remained covered under the policy and declined the damages connected directly to the court's finding of deliberate conduct. Douglas paid the remaining court-ordered amount personally. Grace wasn't interested in celebrating. As soon as the damaged field dried, she hired a local contractor to level the deep ruts left by the bulls. Broken irrigation lines were replaced. Compacted soil was loosened before winter. By early October, the field was ready for a winter cover crop and the next planting season. A few days later, Douglas stopped by the farm. This time he came alone. No attorney. No ranch manager. He parked an older ranch truck beside the road rather than arriving in the polished pickup. Grace remembered from that September morning. He removed his hat before speaking. "I owe you an apology." Grace listened quietly. "I should have taken responsibility much sooner." She nodded. "It would have saved both of us a lot of time." Douglas looked toward the rebuilt fence separating the two properties. "I've already ordered new steel gates and reinforced fencing. There won't be another incident." Grace believed he understood the consequences, not because of his words, but because of everything that had happened. Sometimes experience became the best teacher. Before leaving, Douglas paused. "I spent years building the best breeding herd I could." He smiled faintly. "I never imagined they'd become the strongest witnesses against me." Grace couldn't help smiling. The truth has a way of showing up. After Douglas drove away, Grace walked back into her soybean field. Fresh green cover crops had already begun covering the repaired soil. The damage from September was slowly disappearing. What remained wasn't anger. It was a lesson every farmer understood. Good fences matter. Good neighbors matter even more. Winter arrived early that year. A light frost covered Grace Miller's fields as she walked the fence line one final time before sunrise. The new steel fencing separated her farm from Douglas Kane's ranch. Heavy-duty gates had replaced the old wooden ones. Bright warning signs marked every livestock crossing. Everything looked different. More importantly, everything felt different. A pickup slowed beside the road. It was Ben Harlow. He rolled down the window and smiled. Thought I'd check on the new fence. Grace laughed. So far, it's doing exactly what a fence is supposed to do. Ben waited. Grace smiled. Nothing. He nodded. Sometimes that's the best outcome. They stood quietly for a moment, looking across the fields. The damaged soybeans were gone. In their place, young winter cover crops stretched across the repaired ground. Nature had already begun correcting what had happened months earlier. Before leaving, Ben handed Grace a small envelope. Inside was a certified copy of the court's final order. Case closed. Liability resolved. No appeals had been filed. Grace folded the document and slipped it into her truck. I probably won't look at this again. Ben smiled. You shouldn't have to. A few weeks later, the County Agricultural Extension Office invited Grace to speak at its annual farm safety meeting. She declined the invitation to retell the entire legal story. Instead, she spoke for only a few minutes about something much simpler. Take photographs. Keep records. And never assume the truth will speak for itself. Sometimes you have to preserve it. The room fell silent. Every farmer understood exactly what she meant. As the meeting ended, one young rancher approached her. I've already ordered electronic identification tags for my herd. Grace smiled. They're useful. Sometimes more useful than you expect. Driving home that afternoon, she passed Douglas's ranch. The prize Angus bulls grazed peacefully behind reinforced fencing. The same animals that had once destroyed her soybean fields had unknowingly preserved the evidence that resolved the entire dispute. They had no idea what they had done. They had simply followed the path placed before them. Grace looked once more at the rebuilt fence stretching across the property line. Months earlier, people thought the strongest witness would be an expert, a lawyer, or a judge. Instead, the truth had been carried on four legs. Sometimes evidence doesn't speak. Sometimes it grazes quietly in a pasture, waiting for someone willing to pay attention. If Grace's story reminded you that careful records and quiet persistence can expose the truth, share your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done if 47 prize bulls had suddenly destroyed your crops? Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications for more stories about hardworking farmers, justice, and unexpected evidence. Thank you for watching.